Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's going on in El Salvador because President Nayib Bukele is continuing his aggressive crackdown on gang culture and trying to eradicate decades of gang influence over the country's society and economy. And the latest development in this story is that the authorities in El Salvador have now begun mass trials of alleged gang members, which is taking things to a whole new level. But before we get into the details on all of this, can I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that subscribe button? It really helps me with the algorithm and also puts a smile on my face. Now, just to set the scene, El Salvador is a relatively small country in Central America with a population of around 6.5 million people and GDP of around $30 billion. It sits between Guatemala and Honduras and has a Pacific coastline. It's often referred to as the land of the volcanoes because it has more than 20 volcanoes, and it's becoming very popular as a surfing destination with world-class waves. And more recently it made global headlines, becoming the first country in the world to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender. But one of the most interesting aspects of its economy is the fact that it doesn't really have its own currency anymore. As you'll know if you've been following the channel for a while, we talked a lot about unofficial dollarization, where people in a country choose to use the US dollar because they don't trust their own currency anymore, usually as a result of high inflation, and they want to protect their purchasing power and want stability. However, El Salvador didn't drift into that unofficial dollarization situation. It made a deliberate decision. Back in 2001, the government formally abandoned its own currency, the calon, and adopted the US dollar as its official currency. This is known as formal dollarization. And the reason for doing this was fairly straightforward. At the time, the country was dealing with economic uncertainty, weak investor confidence, and concerns about long-term currency stability as the value was falling. So the government effectively decided that rather than risk devaluation or instability, it would adopt the US dollar and import the credibility of the US monetary system. That brought a number of advantages: lower and more stable inflation, greater investor confidence, easier international trade, and lower borrowing costs. But it also came with a significant trade-off because El Salvador gave up control of its own monetary policy. It can't print money, it can't set interest rates, and it can't devalue the currency at any point in the future. So everything is now tied to the United States. But overall, this policy has been pretty successful for El Salvador in terms of stability, and inflation has remained relatively low, the financial system is more predictable, and it's helped avoid major currency crises. Although economic growth has been fairly modest, and the country still relies heavily on remittances from abroad. So El Salvador has effectively outsourced its currency to the US, while also experimenting with Bitcoin and at the same time running one of the most aggressive law and order crackdowns in the world. And that brings us to the main story of today's video. A few years ago, El Salvador had one of the highest homicide rates in the world, with figures over 100 murders per 100,000 people in many years. Entire communities were controlled by gangs like MS-13 and Barrio 18. These groups controlled territory, extorted businesses, recruited young people, and in many cases dictated daily lives. Following a surge of killings in 2022, President Nayib Bukele declared a state of emergency, and what followed was one of the most dramatic crackdowns we've seen anywhere in the world, with over 75,000 people arrested. But it wasn't just the scale that grabbed attention, it was the way it was presented. Just to put that into perspective, 75,000 people is more than 1% of the population of El Salvador. Now, if you've seen any of my previous videos on this, you may remember the footage. Prisoners had their heads shaved, they were dressed in white shorts, handcuffed and transported in buses in large numbers, and then brought into prison compounds and made to sit cross-legged on the ground in rows, hundreds at a time. All of this was filmed and released online. This wasn't just enforcement, it was a very deliberate message. And that message was reinforced by the construction of a mega prison, the Terrorism Confinement Center. As we covered in detail previously, this facility is designed for mass incarceration. Cells hold up to 100 inmates in one go, with just 2 toilets and 2 sinks. There is minimal comfort, no privacy, and no focus on rehabilitation. The solitary confinement cells are completely dark, made of concrete with no windows and no external contact. The prison is located in a remote area with heavy security, armed guards, watchtowers, and even helicopter surveillance. It's been built to make sure that nobody gets out. Now we're moving into the next phase of this strategy, which is the introduction of mass trials. Instead of processing cases individually, which would take a long time for 75,000 prisoners, authorities are grouping defendants together, sometimes hundreds at a time, often based on alleged links to gangs such as MS-13 and Barrio 18. The government's argument is that these gangs operate as organisations, so they should be prosecuted as organisations. But critics say that this approach risks removing individual justice from the process. There's been strong criticism from international organisations such as Amnesty International, raising concerns about arbitrary detentions, lack of due process, prisoner conditions, and the possibility that some innocent people may have been caught up in the crackdowns. But President Nayib Bukele has pushed back very strongly against this criticism. At one point, he even joked that if other countries are so concerned about these prisoners, they're welcome to take them, making it clear that El Salvador does not want them. Now, despite the criticism, the policy has been extremely popular domestically. Following the crackdown, Nayib Bukele was re-elected with over 80% of the vote, which is an extraordinarily high level of support and shows just how strongly the public backs what he's doing. And the reason for that support is clear. The results are dramatic. The homicide rate has collapsed from one of the highest in the world to one of the lowest in the region. Streets are safer, businesses are operating more freely, and tourism is now increasing. For many people in El Salvador, this is the first time in decades that they've felt safe in their own communities. But the key question remains, has this solved the problem or just suppressed it? Because while gang leadership has been dismantled and networks have been disrupted, the underlying drivers such as poverty and lack of opportunity still exist. And historically, those are the conditions where gangs re-emerge. So what's happening in El Salvador isn't just a local story, it's becoming a global case study. Governments around the world are watching this closely and asking whether this is a model to follow or a line that should not be crossed. It raises a fundamental question about how far government should go to restore order and whether security comes before civil liberties. So where does this leave us? On one side, crime has collapsed in El Salvador, society feels safer, and the government has regained control. On the other, civil liberties have been reduced, legal protections weakened, and thousands of people are caught up in a system that they may not feel is fair. The real question is whether this is a necessary trade-off or a step too far, because what's happening in El Salvador right now could influence policy decisions all over the world. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, and I thought you'd be interested in hearing that they're now having mass trials. So let me know what you think in the comments below, but I'll keep you posted on any further news and developments on this story. If you've liked what I said today, or maybe you didn't like it but you thought it was interesting, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Don't forget, I'm currently running my competition where you come in my property or a cash alternative prize. There's a limited amount of time left on this competition, so if you'd like to get involved, please scan the QR code on the screen now or click the link in the description below. I've got some really exciting offers on the go at the moment. It's a fun way of helping the channel. Thank you also to everyone who supported me in other ways. If you bought me a coffee or sent me YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you so much for that support. Really do appreciate it. It helps keep me focused and making as many videos as possible. Don't forget the Joe and Naz channel is now live. This will hopefully bring a bit of fun and excitement and laughter into your life to offset all of the negativity from some of these videos that I'm making on the political side of things. Well, our latest video is now up and live, and we went and tested out not a full English breakfast, but a full Irish breakfast in Dublin, which is a bit different to a full English. It's similar-ish, but it's definitely worth checking that video out. Hopefully you'll enjoy it. Went to one of the most famous places in Dublin to do that. So please help us out because we need your help. We still don't have enough watch time to meet all of YouTube's metrics, so we need to build up more watch hours. So if you could go and watch that video, there's a link at the end of today's video that'll take you straight through to it. If you could watch that and maybe a few of the other ones and also subscribe whilst you're there, really appreciate it. But in the meantime, here is something to put a smile on your face.